Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding, his church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Ideas podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, president of Q, and man, we are excited about the conversation today. We're going deep into our emotional health, a conversation that for church leaders, for any Christian that's leading anything, for any Christian at all, is foundational to how we're discipling people. I'm so excited to have with us today Pete Scazzero. Many of you have read his books. I know they've impacted me a lot. His book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader, Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. He's written a lot about emotional health. His newest book is called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, moving from shallow Christianity to deep transformation. But what I love about Pete is his life completely embodies this message. For years, I've followed his work. He planted a wonderful church in Queens, New York called New Life Fellowship Church, a large multiracial church with more than 73 countries represented, where he served as senior pastor for 26 years. And then over a several-year process, transitioned the church and the pastoral leadership to Rich Villodas. And many of you have commented on the talk that Rich gave at our April Culture Summit. And the topic was simply called The Failure of Celebrity Christianity. And in 9 minutes, and if you want to go to YouTube, you can watch it, but we'd also recommend you go to Q Media, get a free trial at qideas.org/trial, where you can watch that talk as well as hundreds of others that deal with these kinds of topics. But Rich's talk really hit on what happens when our platform grows bigger than our character. I think for many Christians around the church today, they're noticing a problem of character. They're pointing it out. It's being pointed out for them. We're seeing the failure of maybe Christian leaders, quote unquote, that we're looked up to, that have walked through failures at a very public level. And you start to question what's going on, what's broken about the system. What is it that we're creating in our leaders, and why does it seem to show up more now than ever? And the question will be posed to Pete, why is this happening? What are we seeing? What are we missing? What have we been missing about the way in which our churches have grown, the way that we celebrate certain results, the way numbers has become such an important measure of whether a church is healthy or not? And that just doesn't seem the way Jesus built the church. And so we're going to grapple with some of that today. And so I want to welcome in this conversation now with Pete Scazzero. Well, Pete, welcome to the Q Ideas podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I've just so appreciated your work over the last many, many years, and your approach to helping so many Christians, and especially those in leadership, understand and think well about their own interior life and how that interior life ultimately plays out in impacting the people around them, their families, their church, their organizations, anybody that they're leading. And it feels like you were one of the first. I mean, I know every generation has people that push into that, but it feels like you were willing to just be so transparent with your own journey to help leaders really grapple with something that I would say wasn't that popular to grapple with a couple decades ago. So help our learners today who maybe haven't met you before, haven't read one of these books, but why it was so important to you to push into the inner life, the interior life for leaders.
Well, it came out of hitting a wall and basically getting so stuck in planting a church in New York City, it goes 3 decades ago. And, I'd given my life to study leadership and spiritual formation, having a passion to plant multiracial churches in New York City, especially among the urban poor. And so my wife and I had invested years going to Central America, learning Spanish, coming back to New York, living in the inner city, and then a scratch church plan. And then with 6-7 years into it, so many things were breaking down that we realized that something was faulty in our whole leadership formation. From seminary days, from our parachurch days. And at that point, we've been Christians 17 years. So I think it was out of pain, Gabe. I think it was the pain, the reality of what we were trying to do, which was plant a multiracial church in Queens, New York, that required people being deeply changed by the gospel. It wasn't happening because the deep change wasn't happening in the discipleship we were doing, and we were doing everything we knew. So I think it's out of that, being at that wall, having such a sense of not disillusionment as much as, we love Jesus. We knew Jesus had brought us into this. We just couldn't understand why everything we had learned in leadership conferences and books, something was missing. And I think it was the pain of that multi-year process that God prepared the soil to meet us.
Well, I love that you and your wife, Jerry, together have gone on this journey. And it feels like, as you look at the season of the church in America, it's during the same season where the growth of the megachurch, the growth of large and numbers, and that was the thing that mattered, the thing that people seemed to count and thought was the greatest measure of transformation. Was the same season that you were quickly learning these lessons that, no, this is not it. And in some ways, you've gone out ahead and pioneered now a new way for church leaders who today are now grappling with that fact, and they're realizing, no, that was not the path. That was not a real representation of the maturity of believers. And you've been a little bit ahead. You're just a few steps ahead of where some other leaders are as they try to navigate this, and you can help all of us. And you say in your newest book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, with a subtitle, Moving from Shallow Christianity to Deep Transformation, you really describe that you believe this is time for a total church culture overhaul. Describe what you mean by that.
It's so interesting. You say I was a bit ahead. I think in the early 90s when I was embarking on all this, when I always go to the large church conferences, the mega church conferences, and I felt like such a failure because I wasn't in a growing suburban area. I was dealing with all these racial issues, social class issues, all the constrictions of just simply being in an urban place like Queens. But yet I had this sense of God's hand leading us. But I must admit, I sure didn't feel like I was pioneering anything new. I was just trying to, follow what God had for us. But it was like being on the margins of the empire type of thing, in this obscure place. And so I would, it's interesting because I in 1996 is when Jerry and I, we really had this encounter. I'd been wrestling with kind of evangelical discipleship and formation that we had been schooled in, and going after what are the missing pieces. I went back to my professors at places like Princeton and Gordon Conwell and trying to say, how did I theologically get into this place where I would describe myself as an emotional infant trying to lead a church? And we went back into, theology, historical theology, and the fact basically that we ignore the emotional component of who we are as human beings and how we got there, going back to Augustine and Neoplatonism. And that's why I ended up calling it emotional health. And really all I was going after was serious discipleship that addressed the whole person and included a whole bunch of things in Scripture that we ignore in, I'll simply call it the Western Church. And so it was a slow unfolding. And I was called a heretic by some in the beginning, and some just thought I was going weak on the gospel and all that stuff. And so for me, it was a personal journey, but also a theological journey, because I'm a pastor. I'm not a therapist, and I wasn't trying to be a therapist. I'm trying to equip people into spiritual maturity. But it really has taken many years for me to realize, this is to really say as clearly as I said in the book that you just read, which is, no, we really do need a spiritual revolution. I've been watching this now for decades, and what we're doing is not simply not working. It's bankrupt to really produce sustainable long-term change in people. Yeah, and I feel like people are so awake to that right now. I mean, you think about even, I don't know if you're familiar with this podcast series that Christianity Today's put out called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, all right? I mean, yes, everybody's listening to that. I feel like a whole generation of Gen X and millennials are kind of hearing these stories, and they're seeing kind of the shallowness that's kind of played out about what has become the American church. Yes. And at the same time, you're over here giving what I believe is this antidote where you're going, wait, there's a different way to think about this. The funnels have been built wrong. And I love your illustrations in the book where you kind of build the funnel of where it's like you invert it and go, look, this is not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus
was not start with the big crowd and then slowly start to one day get to discipleship. It's start with discipleship and build out. And that is so counterintuitive to so many people obsessed with progress, metrics, and results. As you flipped that model, I mean, that couldn't have been easy. I'm sure it's been painful, and I'm sure along the way you weren't sure how that was going to play out. But give some hope to those pastors right now who are listening. They're going, look, I've had good intentions, but I kind of just followed the way that I've been shown to do this, and I realized the trappings of it, and it hasn't been working. What are some of those first steps that I as a leader need to take to reevaluate what I've been doing?
Yeah, I'm just reminded, I kept going back over and over again to, of course, Jesus' ministry and the mustard seed kingdom. Western Christianity is that podcast says so well. We're into like the big, right? Success is up and to the right, bigger, better, faster, and that's what's always been touted. And what's interesting is even the folks who are disillusioned, the millennials and even Gen Zs, following. I just see that I'm still measuring success by what other people think, by how it can be measured. And it's so seductive. It's a framework of thinking that's part of our culture, but it's so much part of the church culture now that to hope, I would start with redefining success as becoming the person God wants you to become and doing what God calls you to do. And you do it in his way and in his timetable. It took me years to come to that clear definition of success because I'm being shouted at, and everyone else is hearing these messages day and night from social media, getting likes, you name it, yeah, it sounds good, it preaches good, but in reality is I got to get a crowd in here. I've got to be able to show to people, look what I've done, look what I've accomplished. And so my hope for pastors is first redefine success and begin with yourself. And I began to invest in my own walk with Jesus. That was like, I can't bring people where I've not gone myself. And so I dug into the desert fathers and mothers in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, and have continued of saying, I've got to get to God somehow in terms of get cleansed of the idols of my heart and have my own direct encounter with him, out of which I'd lead this church from some place of depth. That alone was a very big decision to make.
Well, you do talk about the Desert Fathers, and your treatment of that is so interesting, of just making the point that here were people who just left everything to go out and to live a more holy life and assumedly a more sinless life that they were a part of, and they built a community. And if you were to do that today, people would say, I mean, think about it. You're in New York City. What if you were to say, I'm going to leave New York City and go to the country, and I'm going to go build a different kind of community? And, at that time, people would come out to them for wisdom. And you talk about this. I mean, they still were influencing culture.
Yes.
It's very different than what today people would say was worthwhile in doing. And they would say, you're abandoning the culture. So you haven't done that. I mean, you're still in the city. You're still working this out in the context of a neighborhood, of people, of the lost. So what would you say for people who haven't studied the Desert Fathers? What could they take away from that illustration today? What might that look like today?
Well, I think we each have to create a desert, in a sense of a desert, a place where we are alone. They called it the cell. And it can be a chair in your office. For me, it's looking out the window of my office. But I begin to take some of the riches and I think what I've tried to do over these years is translate some of the riches of historical theology, church history, into the local church for today. That we've got to learn from people really different from us. And again, we're going back to the church in Syria and Egypt, Africa, Asia, and how we can, in a sense, we realize how much the culture, Western culture, has so influenced us. And my work has been to translate it into our work today. So I invite people to do, for example, begin to integrate silence and solitude as core to spirituality. So creating a desert means my first priority is, as a pastor or as a leader, is how do I have a being with God and being with myself, reflective, out of which then I lead. That is the first great task. So I've got to slow down my life for the sake of long-term impact, which is what everybody wants, for the kingdom of God to go forth, the name of Jesus to be known, impacting culture in all its forms, arts, politics, you name it, right, in the workplaces. But that requires that we have been cleansed of the idols of our own hearts. And that's what the Desert Fathers want to do, is get into a place where I've got enough silence to recognize the idols in me, as well as in the church and in the culture, so that I can basically help other people get there. But if I don't get there myself, I can't bring anybody there.
Yeah.
So it's very slow and counterintuitive, but it's very powerful. That's the beauty of it. It's like you begin to get set free, and then you begin to bring some other people with you, and it's like, it may look small, like Jesus and the 12 probably didn't look like much. They didn't look like much. And that's why the religious leaders were confused, because he didn't look like, he's doing a lot of miracles, but they're hidden, and they're almost like muted miracles, You can't quite see the loaves and fishes being multiplied, but you see the result of it. And, he would do healings, pulling people outside the village, and almost like he was veiling his identity. And again, it was this imperceptible, looking defeated ministry that was really going to take the whole world. It was upside down. It was crucifixion. It was a crucified Jesus, and it's just so different than everything that I had been taught and modeled for me as a leader. So it's taken me a long time to begin to get free from, I'd say, some of the frameworks of leadership that I think I'd been taught in the church, that were mostly secular models pasted on to the church with a little bit of theology on it.
Yeah, totally. And, you talk about just how when you're faithful like this, your last decades can be some of the most powerful. And I think for a lot of younger people, man, the patience to say, I'm going to go a certain pace here that's going to allow me to stay in tune with right relationship with God and others, and my own rest, my own rhythms. And in a world today that's all about results, productivity, that's what measures, that's what seems to get rewarded. The church just kind of opted into that.
Yeah.
How do church leaders right now? I mean, I know you give some examples of the daily office. There's some practices that you implemented within your organization, your church. What are some of those practical ways that church leaders, organization leaders, even families can be trying to integrate this type of pacing into their life?
Well, I like to begin to slow people down, I like to begin with Sabbath, only because it's a 3,500 year historical tradition within Judaism. That's, part of our church, history as well. And to take a 24-hour period each week to actually stop all work, rest, delight in God, and experience what it's like to be loved and enjoy the beautiful, wondrous world God's made, that life's a miracle, for a 24-hour period every week on a consistent basis. That alone is revolutionary. I like what Walter Brueggemann, the theologian, says. It's resisting powers and principalities that define us by what we do. And when I'm trying to help pastors and leaders, and most are type A like I am and have 3 visions by breakfast like I do, the Sabbath is a great place to start, to learn about Sabbath and begin to practice experimenting with it initially. It takes a while to figure out. I mean, Israelites didn't figure it out right away. It's going to take some time, but to orchestrate it, architect and curate a Sabbath that fits your personality, your life, that's a revolutionary act and a prophetic act for an individual leader to take today. That's, again, in and of itself, powerful.
Yeah, I love the practice of Sabbath. I mean, we this last weekend had a great Sabbath with our family, on the hammocks outside for hours, and just seeing how even our children just respond to that kind of space in their life. Listen to the birds chirp, just enjoying nature. And I know for everybody, there's different ways in which you get filled up again and you get reset. But if we don't start there, you're right. It's like we operate not out of rest, but we operate trying to earn rest. And that is not what God's design was for us. You talk about these 4 failures that you have seen undermine emotionally healthy discipleship. Could you talk about those 4? Just kind of give us a sense of each one of those, and then we might dig into a couple of them.
So the four are tolerating emotional immaturity. The second is emphasizing doing for God over being with God. And the third is ignoring the treasures of church history. And the fourth is defining success wrongly. Now, since we've talked about slowing down, where our doing for God or doing in life flows from a cup that's overflowing of being with God. So that's slowing down is key, which is one big component. But a second big component, as God has led us on this journey, and again, it's just our journey, and is what we call emotional maturity or emotional health. And this is very different than emotional intelligence that many business leaders have been exposed to, which is all very good for the business world. But for us, when we talk about formation in Jesus, when we talk about a person being transformed by Jesus has to impact their entire life, spiritual, relational, intellectual, and as well physical as well as emotional. And so my work in my early years when this journey was, what does it mean to get at that emotional component? And because we had so many people I was exposed to were so gifted, myself too. I was building this great church, but my own wife didn't feel loved by me. I was very out of touch with my emotional world. I was not very self-aware, didn't know how to connect with people well, lowly differentiated. I didn't do sadness, didn't do fear, very unaware of my family of origin impacted me today. And so when I realized this in 1996 is when this whole journey started, and this realizing, oh my goodness, like there's whole stuff in scripture about emotional maturity being connected to spiritual maturity, things like 1 Corinthians 13, all kinds of texts. And it's like a whole world just opened up to me. And so we went, I realized I was an emotional infant trying to raise up mothers and fathers of the faith, and it was almost comical. And here I was having all this Bible in my head, but I had big gaps in my own formation, and it was leaking out everywhere in the culture I was building as a church. So I went full tilt on it, Gabe. I went for a doctorate of ministry in marriage and family because I wanted to make the connection of all the stuff that people do in therapy and therapists and PhDs and say, how does this relate to leadership development? And so I went on a big journey, and so did my wife, Jerry, and pioneering things like genograms of how your family of origin impacts who you are today, grief and loss, and all that stuff in scripture about lamentations. And it was an amazing, freeing journey. So we talk about like what's keeps us shallow in discipleship. Yes, we're going way too fast and we're skimming on the surface. We got to slow down our lives to be with God and ourselves. But then secondly, we ignore this whole huge emotional component of who we are on the inside, and that we don't disciple people in that. We don't deal with it. We don't touch it. And so we think just preaching sermons is going to be enough, and it's not. And so again, I could have been talking to you right now and having crashed and burned, but I knew and Jerry knew that God had rescued us we could have been another leader disaster in the mid-90s, like so many people we knew. And we knew by the grace of God we'd made it.
Yeah. Well, throughout your book, you give all these practical assessments people can take about their own emotional maturity and whether they're an infant in certain areas, an adolescent, mature, adult, really helpful, just practical. I highly recommend this to any leader listening. And if you haven't read earlier books that Pete has written on the emotionally healthy leader, that's where my journey began. And then Emotionally Healthy Church. I mean, there's a lot of these where you've been just helping bring people along on this journey. But when it came to discipleship, this became priority right now in a church that we have, it seems more and more people kind of consuming information and content and learning and podcasts like this, and they turn to this information, but man, not necessarily getting discipled. I think of Paul's moment, I think in 2 Corinthians, where he talks about you have 10,000 teachers, but no fathers.
Yes.
It's this idea that we're consuming content, but we don't have fathers. And discipleship reminds me of fathering. It's like somebody coming along and saying, let me bring you with me and model what this life looks like. And it's just slow. But discipleship for you, I mean, this book, after you've written so many books, this was the one that for this season you felt like God was saying, you got to go in on discipleship. Why is that?
Well, everything rises and falls on discipleship. Worship, giving, mission, body life, marriages, families, children, youth. I mean, there's nothing that's untouched. And obviously, I'm after leaders, just like you are at Q. I mean, you transform a leader, you can transform all the ones everyone they're influencing, their churches or ministries or businesses or nonprofits. But I realized that the problem with leaders is their own discipleship. And so in some ways, I wrote this book to leaders and pastors about discipleship for the whole culture in church, but it has to begin with us as leaders. And again, I had big gaps in my discipleship, and I was doing everything I kind of knew to do at that point, but there were missing holes. And some of that goes back to history. Some of it goes back to just our own blindness at this. And every historical moment has blinders. That's why history and the world is so important for us to be in touch with, so we can help see some of our blinders. But
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a pastor, and I was telling him I was reading your book, and I said, it's a great book. You need to read it. It's convicting me on my own need to produce, have big vision, do things, and not necessarily quiet down and have the quiet space and the reflective time to really hear from Jesus and be with Jesus versus doing. And this person hadn't read your book yet, but just quickly said, yeah, I'm so excited about discipleship. I'm planning for our whole church next month to launch this church-wide discipleship program, and there was part of me, this is a judgmental part of me, but there was part of me going, oh, wait, just please read this before you do that, because there's so much more to this than launching just another program, another small group thing, another way to just get people to circle up and talk about a book or, it's just so much bigger than that. And until, like you said, your focus is on the leader, until the leader is going through that transformation themselves, it's kind of hard to paint that picture and walk people through it.
Gabe, I actually ask people not to bring emotionally healthy discipleship into your church right away, please. Don't. Just bring it to yourself first. Yeah. And that is the death of some ways, the American church. We just keep bringing in program after program, and programs don't change people. And just getting people connected doesn't change people. Just getting people in small groups doesn't change people. Having phenomenal smoke machine-filled, awesome worship services don't change people deeply. And Jesus knew that. And so the question is, how do I begin to disciple people? Well, I've got to begin with my own discipleship and really wrestling with areas where I've got to make sure I'm getting invested in somewhere. And then out of that, slowly begin to bring it to some other people around me, my core team, and then kind of in concentric circles moving out. But the problem is everybody wants it fast. And I get calls all the time, Gabe, hey, I want to do this. We're all in. I'm like, why don't we just start with you? Before you go all in, why don't you see if you're all in? Because everyone, I listen, okay, people like my books, they buy the books. I'm really not in the business of selling books. My goal and my love and my calling is for the church to be transformed. And so we create materials to help that process, but transformation can only come life on life, and it's just slow and messy, and half the people don't work out. It's just hard.
A lot of disappointment, a lot of
exactly,
a lot of challenge. It's real world, real distractions, and lots of times people get that close to it and go, well, I'm not really sure I want this.
Yes.
And that can be discouraging for pastors, and it can make pastors go, well, I don't know if this is working because people are walking away from it. And I think your point to them is, wait, it's probably working. It's probably refining. It's probably producing the kind of demand. And I know when I talked to, a friend of yours in New York City, John Tyson, and when we were in New York City in church, it was, these urban environments, it seems even the younger generations are saying, I want more.
Yes.
I want you to ask more of me, not less of me. I don't want to skim. Give me more here, because if this is real, I realize it has to actually encounter my entire life and has to be something that's going to be part of me all the time and not just a church service that I'm showing up to. And I think sometimes we sort of assume younger generations need just more shallowness, and that is not what they're after.
Yeah, I think COVID-19 really has accelerated that trend, where people are realizing the crowd's not enough. Just having a full room to feel good about things. I can't even have that anymore the way I did. And so, yeah, the young generation, they're desperate for mentors. But you know what? I was desperate when I was 20, 22, 25. I was like, where are the fathers, who can mentor us?
Right.
I think it's just a natural longing. And I pray that people in their, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we can really give ourselves to the next generation, and they can get on our shoulders and, do some really creative wineskin ministries that will fit the changing culture in which we live.
Yeah. Well, in closing, you have a chapter that deals with grief and the need for us to walk through those things and walk through pain. And you do also describe a lot about feeling our feelings. And as you just talked earlier about the types of leaders that tend to lead these large churches and organizations, there's a lot of just kind of moving past the pain to keep going to that next level. And that seems to just be a part of that temperament and personality. Could you just give us a moment here on why is it so important for a leader that might be listening to this, and that's been their journey to date, to take the time to feel feelings, to take the time to go back and look at their family of origin, to look at grief and the story that's been told to them over time, so that would impact the future of their ministry being more healthy?
Listen, I don't know anybody who likes to lean into grief and loss. Okay. I mean, we just naturally go the other direction because it's painful. I'd rather suppress it, medicate it, deny it, shift blame to somebody else. But I don't want to feel pain and enter my grief and loss. But my great exhortation to all of you who are listening in leadership is one of the great leaders, if not the greatest in the Old Testament, was David. 2/3 of the Psalms are laments. He commits adultery and murder and writes a psalm about it, Psalm 51 to be sung in church. We have a whole book called Lamentations, Jeremiah in the midst of the rubble of Jerusalem. And if we're going to grow into maturity ourselves, and to raise up mature men and women around us, we have to become not simply apprentices to grief, but we've got to become masters. Think of a craftsperson, a master electrician or a master plumber, or a master artist. They go through apprenticeship and then journeyman, journeywoman, then they move into mastership. I consider grief a similar journey. We kind of dabble in it, but if we're going to be in leadership, we've got to become like David and Jeremiah and Jesus and master it, where it becomes a part of our being, where the treasures that God has for us in it, we're actually like mining it, because really all of life is about loss, if you think about it. I mean, Jonathan Edwards once wrote a great sermon on the story of Job is the story of us all. But some of us will lose everything in a moment, but most of us will lose everything very slowly till at the end of life we'll have let go of everything. We'll have surrendered. But grief and loss it forces us to confront our self-will. We're not in control. And the invitation is we surrender to a God that, my gosh, he's wild. And this process of, what are you doing, God? I don't know, but I trust you. It's a very vulnerable, weak place to be in. But we've got to go there first. And, I'm still growing and maturing in grief and loss. It's not that I like to do, but to go through COVID like we've just gone through and just like, okay, man, let's get on back to where we were. That is dooming the church to immaturity. Yeah. It's really a moment for us to pause and say, and to grieve and ask God, what are the new things you want to birth through this? How are you coming through this? What are you saying to me through this and to us through this as a church? But to just go back and skip over and say, glad that's over, that would be a recipe for stagnation.
That's good. Well, thank you for those words. And I think for leaders listening, I hope they've been impacted by just hearing just a taste of the journey you've been on and the way in which you're helping so many of us walk through that and to wrestle with some of these deeper areas of our life that might be covered up very easily by distraction or success or performance, that must be wrestled with if the church is going to regain health and truly be what I believe God envisions for the church to be. So we just thank you and commend you for your great work.
Gabe, thank you. And thank you for Q and all your great work as well. It's wonderful. We've got our places in God's great kingdom in the world. It's wonderful. So thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation, that back and forth. I mean, it was so helpful for me, not only reading his books, but hearing his perspective and the way he just keeps pointing us back to like our ultimate health is going to be found in the private place, in the secret place, not in the public place. And when that secret place is off, when that is not being invested in, it absolutely will impact everything that we lead, everyone that looks up to us, every relationship that we have. And in a world like today where that's not celebrated much, it's countercultural. We have to fight for it. We have to work for it. We have to have people around us, friends around us, those who love us, hold us accountable to do it. And so I couldn't recommend more to you his book, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship, moving from shallow Christianity to deep transformation, not for your whole church, but for you. Take a moment to take some time to read this book, to process it, to go through the assessment, to self-assess where you sit on this chart. You know, are you an emotional infant or are you mature? And what areas do you need to see some health grow in? And where do you need to invite Jesus in to help you walk through that? Is there grief you need to process? Is there feelings that you've been covering up that are making you a very unhealthy person to be around? These are some of the questions that will come up as you read that book. And you can learn more about his work at emotionallyhealthy.org. And I hope you'll do that. I hope you'll go through that process. Summer's such an important time where we all take a few moments. I know not everybody just takes big breaks, but there are a few extra moments to pull out that book, to read, to step away from all the demands of life and to invest in who you're becoming. And so I think this book would be a great tool for that. Well, thank you again for being a part of this community. Please share this with other friends. Share this with people. If you're on an elder board, if you're part of a board of an organization, even with just your team, share this conversation. Let it be an encouragement to others about doing that inner work, the hard inner work that's so critical to come before any of that work that anybody else sees. So we hope you have a wonderful week and a great July.